Hey everybody, this is Aaron from Aaron's Audio Corner, and today I'm reviewing the Buchardt A500 speaker. Now, these were sent to me by Buchardt. I was not paid for the review. I don't get any kind of special treatment, and I wasn't given these speakers. So this is just typical old review, but I want to get that out of the way up front. These speakers retail for about 3,500 euro, which I believe is around 4,100 USD. And I was also loaned it's either the Platin or the Platin. I'm not necessarily sure how you pronounce it, but it's kind of like a hub, right? It's a wireless hub that allows you to connect some hardware to the back of it. You've got HDMI, optical, coax, and USB audio, as well as analog input, RCA at least, into it. And then you can send the signal wirelessly to each of these speakers. So that is really cool. The other thing that I'll go ahead and just say up front, yeah, man, love the speakers. Fantastic speakers. Great speakers. The only thing subjectively that I wish that was different about them is that they would have a larger radiation pattern. And that's just a personal preference thing. We'll talk about that in the data in a little bit, but they're about plus or minus 50 degrees. So they're pretty good. They're right on that tipping point for me. I want a little bit more though, right? Consider their size too. I mean, that's a actual bookshelf size speaker, and they play flat. No joke. They play flat and echoic and in room down to 25 hertz with the proper setting. But in order to do that, you're going to lose the output capability that you might want out of a bigger speaker or a speaker of its size that just doesn't go as low. Having said that, the speakers in my room were around 103 to 105 dB for the pair at 3 meters away. No mechanical noise whatsoever. No issues with any kind of distortion that I heard. And I would not recommend anybody listen to a speaker that loud. But I'm mentioning this because when we look in the data later at the compression, we're going to see that there's some hard limiting going on in the speaker. But it doesn't seem to be a problem when you're listening to a pair in a room under normal circumstances. But if you're out like 4 meters or more, and or you want to listen to much higher volumes or have a whole lot of dynamic range swing, then you're going to want to consider one of the other DSP, not options. What's the word I'm looking for here? Master tunings. That's what they call these. And all that is just you plug a USB stick into the back of this thing with the proper tuning loaded, and then you can have whatever sound profile you want loaded into the speaker. Now, Buchardt has about 11 different master tunings, is what they call them now. The one that I was sent and the one I preferred the most and listened to the most was what they called the theoretical new or theoretical flat new, I believe. You can choose from a variety though. They have some that are called warm. There's a high pass version available, and they play with the tonal profile. They play with some of the output capabilities of the speaker. So you have plenty of opportunity to alter the sound profile and play with whatever it is that you want to play around with. And once you've landed on a master tuning that you like, well, the cool thing about this little hub is that it allows you to wirelessly jump into the speaker and change their equalization with an app. With that same app, you can use your phone's built-in microphone to room EQ. So it will have it. It's kind of funny. You actually walk around the room with the microphone in hand, and it will play a series of noise, pink noise, and it will detect the room modes and it will try to equalize those out. And then once that's done, you can still go in and manually do some adjustments. So I'm showing you some examples here in real time of what I was doing as I was playing around with the room EQ, as well as the manual EQ adjustments. That alone makes the additional price for the Platin hub well worth it, in my opinion. I think it's another 300 bucks right now on sale, and it might be maybe 500 or so regular price for the hub, in addition to the cost of the speakers. But when you're spending this much money on these speakers, if you can't afford it right away, maybe save up another month or something like that. Get that hub. I'm telling you, without the hub, you're really going to be missing out. So I think it's a no-brainer, in my personal opinion. Now, the speaker itself features a 6-inch woofer on the front, a 3/4-inch dome tweeter on the front, and a large waveguide. Love that bearing sound. This is what cheap Amazon turntables get you. And then another 6-inch woofer on the back. You have an analog XLR input back here as well. You got a USB port to plug in for your different master tunings, on-off switch, and then you have the ability to set where you want the speaker located. And that's for the purpose of the WISA or WISA, WISA wireless I don't know, algorithm, whatever it is. And it's honestly not something that I've ever used before, so I'm not too familiar with it. I stick to the simple stuff because I get too far in the weeds with the other stuff and I'll never get anything done. I want to touch on this tweeter. Now, I know that you've probably seen the marketing stuff in Buchart's website saying, why such a small tweeter? And I'm not going to give you the marketing stuff. I've been DIYing speakers for well over a decade now. I've blown a number of tweeters. I've played around with different designs and making my own, blowing other people's stuff up. Sorry to everybody whose stuff I ruined. But what I can tell you is the waveguide design and the use of this 3/4 inch tweeter is legit. Generally speaking, you don't want any distance between a tweeter and a mid. You want everything coaxially aligned, but you don't have that with this speaker, right? The purpose for doing that would be to have one single solid point source, but most speakers aren't built that way. They separate the tweeter from the mid. So the further out you get, the further in wavelength you get, the less cohesive the two speakers are playing together out in the room, right? As you listen away from the speaker. The waveguide allows you to control dispersion, but it also bumps up that bottom end of the tweeter a little bit more to allow the tweeter to cross over a little bit lower than it normally would. So that bump up in the low end sensitivity allows them to use a 3/4 inch tweeter, and that 3/4 inch tweeter allows a little bit more controlled dispersion in the higher frequency. So it's really a best of both worlds in theory. In practice, what happens most of the time, you pop tweeters all day long. But this speaker is controlled via DSP, so you don't really have to worry about that. And the design is such that it's still kind of a moot issue. Now, certainly if you were being crazy or just plain dumb, you could pop a tweeter in a design like this easy, right? But within reason, and as long as the speaker is designed well, you don't have to worry about that. And this tweeter waveguide is designed well. And the cool thing about this waveguide, and I don't know this for sure because eyes can play tricks on you, right? But it looks to me like the flare of the waveguide in the tweeter area is a little bit more steep, so there's not as much flare right there. What that means is you're going to get a little bit more boost in the sensitivity on the low end of the tweeter, but as it goes out from the tweeter, it starts to flare out a little bit more and become more of a waveguide shape. So you get that true combination of horn at the lowest of the frequencies and waveguide at the higher of the frequencies. Now, the thing about horns and waveguides, generally speaking, all horns are waveguides. If I put my hands around my mouth, I'm sure you've seen this demo before, you notice that my voice becomes a little bit more boomy. It's because it's enhancing that lower frequency. That's the horn, right? Well, this right here, my hand on the outer portion, is a waveguide. So as I taper this, I can control not just the low end sensitivity, but I can also control the dispersion of the higher frequencies that are coming out of my mouth and how they interact in the room. And that's really kind of the difference between the horn portion and the waveguide portion. So the horn loads and the waveguide guides. And that's really what they've done here. They have a good combination between those two. And that's how you get away with using a small dome tweeter in a design like this without having to worry about any kind of issues. Now, having said that, there is still some lobing going on in the vertical radiation plane, but I would personally take that trade-off any day of the week in order to get the good horizontal dispersion pattern that they have in this particular speaker. So what I want to do now is I want to jump into the data because you guys know that I'm not too high up on the subjective stuff, right? Because anybody can tell you anything sounds a certain way, but my taste could be different from yours. The data is really what allows us to analyze the true performance of the speaker and separate, the really, really cool, neat stuff from the, okay, that's interesting stuff, right? Before I do that, though, I will say, if you're wondering if I like the speaker and if I would own it if I were in the market for such a speaker, yes, that's an easy answer. That's a yes. Would I personally buy it right now? No, because honestly, these speakers, they don't speak to me. I like big speakers and I don't have a use for bookshelf speakers. But if I were looking for a bookshelf speaker, I was looking for a little bit something smaller, and I was looking for an all-in-one package, this would absolutely be on my list. There's no question. Nobody's paying me to say that. I'm not even getting affiliate links from these things. So this is all 100%. This is just my opinion, okay? So let's go ahead and flip over into the data and we'll get to talking about that. But before we do that, I want to mention that all of this data that you see collected here was done so with the theoretical flat setting, and it was done so via my Clipple near field scanner. Now, this is a state-of-the-art robotic masterpiece that allows you to get true anechoic data out of a speaker in a non-anechoic environment. And that's wonderful because it allows us to characterize the performance of the speaker without the influence of the room. So first off, we're going to look at the CEA 2034 data set. Now, what you see here in black is the on-axis response, and then the blue is the early reflections, and then the red is the sound power response. In green, we have the listening window response. So the listening window is plus or minus 30 degrees to the side of the speaker, plus or minus 10 degrees above and below the speaker. And looking at the listening window, what we want to see is we want to see it follow the on-axis response, because that basically means that whatever is firing toward you directly when you have the speaker aimed at you is also going to be going out into the room. So you're going to have kind of the same sphere of sound coming at you from all angles of the speaker, and then whatever is reflected off the boundaries in the room, such as the walls and the floors and things like that, are going to be close in timbre to the on-axis sound. That's good because anything that's different in timbre is going to change things. It's going to cause smearing of images and tonality shifts and things like that, just stuff that you generally don't want. Also, the good thing about a speaker that behaves on-axis and off-axis pretty linearly, and when I say linearly, I mean within like the same general performance overall, is that that speaker would take more to equalization. So you can customize this response however you want without having any issues, as opposed to a speaker that behaves one way on axis and radically different off axis. Well, whatever you hear in your seated position is a combination of those two sounds. So you can't fix one without fixing the other. If you don't like the sound that you hear in your seat, it could be because of the on axis sound. It could be because of the off axis sound. You can't fix one without the other. So you want a speaker that performs pretty much the same way in all regards. This speaker does that. And how do I know it does that? Well, I can look down here at the early reflections directivity index, and I can see a pretty good line go through here, except for this crossover region. But I know that the crossover region is causing that bump in the vertical region. And how do I know that? Well, we'll have vertical data that we can talk about in a little bit, but I do know that is the case here. On-axis response is pretty dang flat. It's within about plus or minus 1 dB, which is brilliant for a speaker. And notice that's 25 hertz anechoic response down here. So it extends anechoic down to 25 hertz. But as I said earlier, there are issues when you start turning it up higher. That anechoic flat response will start to roll off a little bit earlier. But that's not really a big deal unless you listen at far distances and or at really high output volume. The estimated in-room response shows a trend line running through about like this. And this bump right here would tend to sound a bit bright in most rooms, I think. In my room, I didn't really have that issue, and I think that could have been because of the sidewall treatment that I have in my room, which would pad some of that off-axis sound down a little bit. But as I said, the speaker also takes well to EQ, and we know that from this line being pretty flat. So even if you didn't have treatment that could pad that upper level down some, or hey, maybe you want it a little bit more boosted, you could take some EQ in the app, bump it right back up or knock it right back down, do whatever you want to it. This speaker will respond very, very well to that. This is the horizontal off-axis response. And what we're looking for here is a falling off response that trends with the on-axis response right up here. And the only deviation that I'm seeing is right around 600 hertz or so. And that's an indication of some kind of resonance. Now, is that resonance audible? Is it problematic? Well, it's not ideal in an ideal world, but all speakers have some kind of compromise, right? So if that's this speaker's compromise, then I think that's a compromise that I'm willing to accept. And for what it's worth, I didn't hear any issues with that out of this particular speaker, notably because it's not standing out in the overall axis amplitude, right? Off axis, yeah, it's bumped up a little bit, but it seems to be that it only becomes problematic as you go further off axis. And I'm seeing that right around this, probably about 50 degrees or so. Now I want to talk about the horizontal radiation pattern. Generally speaking, I like a speaker that is wide. Why do I like that? Because that seems to get more room involvement, gives me a little bit more apparent source width. It makes it sound like images are coming from further than the speakers themselves. I personally say that that's about plus or minus 50 degrees, and that's based on all the listening tests that I've conducted and comparison to the data. And in this case, what we see is the radiation pattern is about plus or minus 50, maybe just a little bit above that. So that's okay to me. If it were plus or minus 40, then it probably wouldn't be as enjoyable for me personally. Now, some people prefer a more narrow radiation, Some people like a more narrow radiation because they have a very lively room. The room that I was listening to in is a dedicated home theater space with treatment galore, so I don't really have to worry about any hard reflections or anything of that nature, and that's generally why I prefer a broader radiation pattern. But some people may like a more narrow radiation pattern, so just keep that in mind. Now, this is the vertical radiation pattern. You would be out here, and then the back of the speaker is back here, up and down here. And we can see the hole in the response above and below the tweeter. Now, I said this earlier was going to be the case because the tweeter can only cross so low to be playing in safe limits. Even though it plays rather low considering for its size, it still doesn't play low enough to match up to a quarter wavelength of the distance between the tweeter and the woofer physically. So there is going to be some off-axis lobing effect going on. But luckily, it's outside of that plus or minus 10 degree range. So you've got some freedom as far as where you sit vertically. And I'm okay taking that trade-off in order to get the superb off-axis response that this speaker has. Now let's talk about distortion. Remember I said too that this speaker has DSP built in, and DSP built in means it's bumping up the low bass in order to make it play flat. And because of that, you're going to start running into issues with maybe distortion, certainly some limiting built in to protect the woofers. So at 86 dB, you can see you run into about 3% THD at about 80 hertz or so. And to me, I think that's okay for a speaker this size. Now at 96 dB, you're still well within that. Well, why didn't 96 dB shoot up through the roof? Well, let's look at the next graphic. Built-in limiting. And this graphic shows me that from 76 to 86 dB, there's some hard limiting on the woofer. And then as you go to 96 and then to 102 dB, there's even more hard limiting on the woofer. And there's some limiting in the midband and through the tweeter as well. So that's kind of a combination of making sure that the speaker doesn't blow up, but also providing you with some dynamic range if you're listening at lower volumes without causing the speaker to mechanically pop or anything like that. Looking at this data, I would think this speaker is not intended to play loud by any stretch. And certainly that's a case to some degree, but in my listening room, I got it to about 103 dB at 3 meters for the pair. And in doing so, yes, the bass was trimmed off, but it wasn't exaggerated like this indicates. So with music and things of that nature, with two speakers and in a room, I think most people are probably going to be okay. I'm a bit of a loud speaker junkie, and this speaker really honestly didn't pose a problem for the output levels that I needed. Now, having said that, if I were going to be using this speaker from a maybe 4 meter distance and with really loud music, then I would probably change the setting to something that's a little bit more safe and then add a subwoofer to the speaker. Now that's going to be it for the theoretical new setting, which is the majority of what I'll listen to on. I'm going to quickly blow through some of these other settings that are offered, but these aren't all of them. So again, I encourage you to go check out Buchart's website and find the other ones that are there. This is the theoretical standard setting. And again, we see a pretty good flat neutral response, except for that resonance around 600 is standing out. And then we have a boosted treble area as well. So if you like that, great. Now you know what it looks like. The theoretical all-around new is somewhere in between the previous two that I just showed you. The warm setting is the one that makes you go, what the heck? It's crazy, right? It's just all sorts of weird stuff, but these are tailored EQ settings that Buchardt is just kind of playing around with, and they put it out there to see what the customer base, and Mads actually told me that a lot of customers like this sound, which I find quite interesting, and I'm curious how that lines up with, you know, their room, what their in-room response curves look like as well, and if they're doing any kind of post-equalization to tweak things a little bit more after that. But here's the data for you if you're curious about that. Now, this is the neutral high-pass 60 hertz setting, very similar to the warm setting, except we can see that it drops the bass to protect the drivers. And that's it for the objective portion. Just to recap a few things, I really like this speaker. It just sounds really good. There's nothing really bad to say about it. If you don't like it, get the Platin Hub, play around with the EQ, play around with the different master settings. I like the theoretical new setting, the one that I showed you initially. I think it was great. It has a good mix of linearity and a good soundstage width, but personally, I do wish it was a little bit wider just because I like that kind of thing. In terms of output, I think I said around 103 dB in my listening room, and that was without any mechanical failure. And I started to get toward the edge of that, and I was like, okay, I'm not going to push this speaker any further. I think I've proven that it gets loud enough. So that's it. I appreciate you watching. If you haven't subscribed, please consider doing so. Hit the like, thumbs up button. Leave a comment if you have any questions. Remember, I was not paid for this review. I did not get anything for free or anything of that silliness. So I encourage you, if you like what you see here, to please consider joining my Patreon. I have different tiers. If you want to help out monthly, that would be cool. I also have a way that you can donate via PayPal if you just want to kick $5 toward my way to help me buy a cheeseburger for supper tomorrow or something like that. I think that's it for this review. Once again, I do appreciate you watching, and I will talk to you all later. Take care. Peace.